With the fervor surrounding the upcoming Black Sabbath box set that celebrates the Tony Martin era, or at least all the IRS recordings, the Eternal Idol was the last album that, to that point, Black Sabbath had done with Warner Brothers. With that being stated, there have Classic Rock magazine, a couple other magazines are really giving attention, well deserved, to the Tony Martin era, which has all but been erased, at least outside of heavy metal culture, by Sharon Osbourne and her control of the Black Sabbath name. So again, with all the, not even hype, all the deserved attention that it is now receiving, I thought that for those who know and for those who don't know, we would delve into the Tony Martin era of Black Sabbath. And today I will start with chapters from a book called Born Again by Martin Popoff. Born Again is the second part to a couple of books he's written about Black Sabbath, and this book delves with Black Sabbath in the 80s and 90s. And we're going to skip all the way in and start with chapter 14 that starts with the Eternal Idol. So the writing will have been written with the idea that you have read the first 13 chapters. I will do my best to address that without slowing down the momentum of the chapter. So let's get started. Album 14, The Eternal Idol. Quote, "Some idiot told me that I had a good voice." After Black Sabbath's inglorious UK tour, Sabbath 86, the touring lineup, which consisted of Tony Martin, the bass player B. Spitz, Eric Singer, who now is with Kiss, of course, their Geoff Nicholls, and Ray Gillan, best known for his time with Badlands, Sabbath 86 set up in Birmingham for rehearsals concerning what might come next. Significantly, the band, who had shifted management from Jim Simpson to Patrick Meehan to Sandy Pearlman en route to Mr. Big Don Arden, had now hooked up with Patrick Meehan Jr. Although the father was still involved, inevitably money problems were to surface, but the immediate crisis was that the band was having a hard time writing. Most pertinently, Eric and Dave realized their new lead singer was a bit of a Graham Bonnet. Great voice, but alas, he didn't write songs. With nobody being paid and no work getting done, word came down that the band was, quite surprisingly, going to fly off to the plush and pricey Air Studios in Montserrat to record their next album. Before the smoke cleared from the tropical debacle, Black Sabbath would have a new bass player and a new singer. With respect to the former, the man who got the call was none other than Bob Daisley of Widowmaker, Rainbow, Ozzy Osbourne, and most recently, Gary Moore fame. Quote, "I wasn't actually in the band Black Sabbath," clarifies Daisley. "I came in to do the album because I had been working with Gary Moore at the time. This was October of 86. I got a phone call from Geoff Nicholls, who was producing the Sabbath album, The Eternal Idol. And I, obviously working with Gary Moore, had met Geoff Nicholls because he had done some of the Gary Moore albums, and their bass player Dave Spitz had to go home back to America because they were in Montserrat in the West Indies, and he had to go home to take care of some business or personal things or something, and they wanted to get on with the album." Unquote. Quote, "So Geoff Nicholls gave me a call and said, 'I'm doing a Sabbath album. We need someone to play bass on it. Would you be interested?' And I said, 'Yeah, I'll do it.' So we worked out the financials and all that, and within a couple of days, I was in the West Indies doing the Sabbath album. I got on a plane the next day, or maybe a day after that, and I went into the studio and I said, 'Play me a track, but without the bass on it, because I don't want to be influenced by what somebody else has done.' I had a listen. I did the track, and then Tony Iommi came in and had a listen back, and he looked up at Geoff Nicholls and said, 'Let him do whatever he wants.' And then he walked out. Obviously, he loved what I had done on that first track, and he said to give me a free hand, and I ended up doing the whole album. I think there is a credit on that album for Dave Spitz because he was the bass player in the band and had been on the road with them, and I had just come in to do the album, but I did play on the whole album. I mean, it's all me. Unquote. But Tony was great to work with. I like Tony. It was a pleasant situation. They did ask me to join the band, actually several times. Patrick Meehan, the manager, asked me to join, and Tony asked me to join. But I heard things about their management, and I wasn't sure. And I was sort of happy with Gary Moore. Personal, who wouldn't be? And doing that. So I said, no, I'll just stay where I am. So I did the album, and that was it. I wasn't actually in the band. I didn't join. Dave's departure had to do with a host of things. He had found out, through the press of all places, that his girlfriend had hooked up with Eric Carr from Kiss. And Eric Carr's replacement he had been playing with. Unbeknownst to all of us, to be honest. There were money problems with the band, and relationships were bad with both Geoff Glicksman as well as Patrick Meehan. Case in point, Spitz mentions the aggravating phone system, while Glicksman says he was always on the phone to his girlfriend, not around to work when he was needed. In any event, he had had enough and decided to leave, or was slightly pushed. Explained Ray Gillan in pre-release press with Hit Parader, quote, the guy who was in the band, Dave Spitz, is a good friend of mine. In fact, he got me into the group. But when we were recording the album Montserrat, he was having a number of personal problems, and people told him he should think about going home until he could straighten them out. So Daisley came in. I think he was an old friend of Tony's, and he's been a major help. He's a very gifted songwriter. He wrote virtually all of Ozzy's material, and he really helped me with my songwriting. I came up with the concept of a song, write it, give it to him. Then he'd add some things and really polish it up. I hope he decides to go on the road with us, but we're not sure about that at the moment. Unquote. As it turns out, Daisley would work many of the lyrics for the record, collaborating with Ray, but then when Ray was out, the lyrics were reworked once more. Geoff Nicholls, who was also involved in the lyrics, as we shall shortly see. But first, there was the shocking departure of Ray Gillan, which again was complicated. First off, Ray couldn't write, and then it was found that he knew nothing about recording or working in a studio in general. Compounding this, he didn't seem to want to compensate by concentrating on the job, partying until all hours of the night with women ready at his feet. If you don't know who Ray Gillan is, good looking dude. Money was an issue as well, as it was with Dave and an increasingly cantankerous Glicksman, and then Ray had left to join Blue Murder, which fell through when he and John Collender didn't see eye to eye. Ray would of course end up making his mark on two torrid and classic Badlands albums, shortly thereafter dying of AIDS-related complications on December 3rd, 1993. And as Iommi explains, that's how we get to Black Sabbath's Tony Martin years. Quote, my best friend from school managed Tony Martin in his band, says Iommi, referring to Albert Chapman. And when we were looking for a singer, Albert said to me, why don't you try Tony? And I said, well, he's with one of your bands. And he said, well, he is, but he could do with a break. Why don't you try him? So I did, and I liked what he was doing. I really liked his voice, and we've done quite a few albums together. But it's hard to bring a new singer in again. It's always been very difficult under the Sabbath name. You can understand that people won't accept something just like that, Sabbathers being a particularly hard breed of fans. And if you bring somebody in and they don't like it, my answer to that was, I brought people in just to keep it going. If you change and people say, why do you have so many people in? Well, in recent years, if you can't make somebody stay in the band, if somebody leaves, you got to replace them. Quote, I have no idea. Nobody ever expanded on it, unquote, says Martin, when asked why Ray was out and he was in. The very little I know about it, the guy to talk to about this is Geoff Nicholls, the keyboard player. He knows the whole story, but as far as I understand, Ray wasn't cutting it because he wasn't turning up or something like that. He was kind of lazy, not that's a terrible word to use. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but he wasn't there doing it when they needed to do it. And I think it got to a point where they needed to move on. As for whether Gillan had been sick with AIDS already, Tony figures, I really don't know. I think he's like Elvis. I think he's still alive somewhere. You know what I mean? I wasn't familiar with his condition. It was also glossed over, although I do remember getting to meet him in England, and I've got the recordings of Ray singing the Eternal Idol demos, and it was okay. The thing I had about Ray was that his voice sounded great, but you couldn't understand what he was saying. The words, his diction, you couldn't understand what he was saying. But nice enough guy. But I have no idea really the full score of that. This has been discussed by Geoff Nicholls and Bob Daisley, this idea that Ray was a vowel singer, a vibrato singer like Ronnie, and that they found themselves reworking the songs just so A, Ray could get through them, and B, so you could understand what he was saying. In any event, his 6-month stay with the band was now over. Tony Martin further explains his circumstances around his hiring. Quote, you have to understand that Birmingham ain't that big, and everybody tends to know everyone else. So the manager I had at the time knew Black Sabbath, because they had all went to school together, and they even worked in some of the same places when they were growing up, and they'd been lifelong friends. And in fact, he worked with the band as tour manager when Ozzy was in the band, and they'd lost contact for years, and then he got into management, and I met him, and he got me the gig. So it's down to my manager, really, which was kind of weird, because he kind of did himself out of a job almost, because they had their own management and they didn't allow anyone else to make management decisions because, well, they already had management. So he kind of sat twiddling his thumbs for quite a while, not being able to really get into it. When asked about his pre-Sabbath history, his main act being the Alliance, Tony Martin chuckles, oh my God, I can't go into that. There's too many of them, just general bands here, there, and everywhere. I've worked with all kinds of people, from Bernie Marsden to Adrian Vandenberg to John Sykes. I did the Blue Murder thing with him. That was done up at your place, Toronto. But I worked in all sorts of bands. With Adrian Vandenberg, we were going to try to get something together. I went to his home in Holland, and I've got a picture of him when he got the phone call to join Whitesnake. And it's a momentous photo. I framed it and put it on the wall because it's him on the phone getting the call. He put the phone down and said, I've just got the gig, so we ain't going to be working together. And I said, that's great, mate. That's cool. Don't worry about it. It's really okay. Go for the Whitesnake thing. I like Adrian, and I think he's really good. And I tell everyone this story, but he nearly killed me in a car accident. But I like Adrian. But I kind of lost contact with him, as you do in the industry, because, people move. But before Sabbath, it was mainly smaller bands doing compilation albums and stuff like that. I really hadn't gotten into the industry full until the Black Sabbath thing. We had deals and serious tracks were released on, but like I said, compilation albums. But mainly I worked with smaller bands, kid bands, really, because I was a kid then. I really wasn't that old. The guys in Sabbath were much older than me. Turns out Martin, 29 going on 30, as he's joining Sabbath, is quite talented among and beyond the vocal role. I play everything: bass, drums, guitar, keyboards, violin, harmonica, just do everything. But I've been in it like 37 years. I just pick up things along the way. That begs the question, did that help Tony Martin secure the Sabbath gig? That he could articulate things in a musical language? Quote, not really. It did help me to understand what they were doing. I think that's where some artists fall away, because if there's a problem and you don't understand what's going on, you ain't going to understand how to deal with it. Musically as well, obviously you use your ears and your heart a lot. But if you are able to convey the idea with something that they understand as well, for example, if I'm getting an idea, no, not that bit, this bit, put your hands this way, if I can just pick up a guitar and show them, an A, oh, right, okay. So it does help in that respect. But it didn't help me to get the job. It's just something I do. If I'm trying to get an idea across to somebody, I'll just play it. Actually, I was a guitarist before I was a singer. I started playing guitar when I was 7 years old, and I was a guitarist right up until I was 28 or something like that. And then some idiot told me that I had a good voice, and I believed him, so I put the guitar down and picked up a microphone. Up until that point, I was always a guitar player. And I always did backing vocals. I never did lead vocals. I played in all sorts of bands and did backing vocals. I never really thought about it before until someone said, "Hey, you can sing." And I said, "No, stop." The real test of it all, after doing a few bands on lead vocals, was with Black Sabbath. I mean, shit, throw Tony in at the deep end. It all developed from there, really. Inspiration, influence-wise, Tony Martin told Alison Bear, as a child of the 70s, bands like Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin, but also bands like The Sweet, T-Rex, but those were the only bands of that genre, and there wasn't another Led Zeppelin or another Mark Bolan. Although it varied, there weren't that many different kinds of bands around, so we were forced to listen to that. Unlike today, where there's 100 different bands that sound like the Foo Fighters, etc., we were kind of forced to listen to it, and it put me in good stead as it widened my musical appreciation. I took my first girlfriend to see Sabbath when I was 14, recalled Tony, speaking with the Legendary Rock Interviews. I remember thinking how bad and great they were at the same time. I thought, in my misguided youth kind of way, that if the singer fell off the stage and couldn't continue, I would get up and do it. But I never thought I actually would one day. But like I say, I started on guitar. Somebody advertised for a player singer, and I dutifully took my guitar along. Then they decided that they didn't want a guitarist, just a singer. So it was like, you can leave with the guitar, and you can leave the guitar in its case. I was like, all right then. And they loved it so much that they wouldn't let me play guitar. I'm not sure if that was because of my great singing or my crap guitar playing. To be honest, yeah, that's where it started. From then onwards, I was always known as a singer, not a guitar player. I started playing things when I was 5 years old, Tony said to Peter Hodgson from Gibson, ergo the license to be a little technico. I had my first guitar when I was 7, which I still own. It's an acoustic guitar that is completely warped, and the action is about half an inch. But I got sounds out of it, and I kept exploring with other things, electronic projects, and taking things apart and rebuilding them. The most famous of my musical explorations was harmonizing with my mother's Hoover. I learned a lot about note interaction just by using the constant drone tone from that vacuum. Also, I had an Akai, forgive me, I don't know this word, Akai 1721 reel-to-reel machine, and I wanted to multi-track record stuff. I figured that if I unsoldered the wires off of the race head, I could get to record over the previous take. It of course faded the more times I recorded over it, but it was another step in exploring stuff. It hasn't stopped to this day. I still explore with samples and sounds and electronic stuff. Guitars are my main instrument. If I want to write, I always pick up the guitar first. My original first pride was a Gibson 335 Semi, which I am gutted to say I sold for £2 sterling when I was 14. Clearly had no idea what I was holding. And I also destroyed a Reslo ribbon microphone, a genuine 1940-ish one, in the interest of exploring the inner workings. I don't think I want to reveal anything else, or I might slash my own wrist. As for who else Sabbath might have auditioned for the frontman role, Martin says, "Yeah, I know, but I don't even know if I should say actually, but it was one of those situations where nobody was interested in working with Sabbath. You know what I mean? Because either they wouldn't turn up or they canceled gigs. They were like a risk, and it stemmed from the when Ozzy was in the band, apparently, my manager was telling me that he would have to sort of drag him out of hotels and out of bed and God knows what else just to do the gig. And they'd have him locked up just so they knew where he was. So it was kind of stemmed from that. I mean, Sabbath is a big name, a big beast in the world of rock music. It's just that promoters had to, well, you had to be insured. Like, if the band doesn't play, somebody has to pay for all that, like the posters that get done and the t-shirts that get printed. It costs money, and record companies were a bit leery. It's all different now. They've got the reunion and they just touch anything and it turns to gold. But then when I joined, nobody really wanted to work with Sabbath, and Tony had tried to do one album as a solo album, The Seventh Star, and they wouldn't let him do a solo album. That was with Glenn Hughes singing. There were problems with those shows, and even with the Ronnie version of the band, although I don't know if I can officially quantify what they were. But the general pattern was that Sabbath was difficult to work with. So when I joined, they had gotten about as low as they could get. They had gotten an unknown singer, this young kid from Birmingham, not really been in the industry. They went that low to find somebody to sing for the band. So I kind of take credit. I don't know if I'm allowed to take credit for myself, but for building the band back up from a little. Because I never missed a show. In like 10 years, my association from 1987 till 1997, and in those 10 years, I never missed a show unless it was canceled by them for some reason or another. Even if my voice was really hopeless, I still went on and did it. So it helped to build the band's credibility back up. But it was a real shock when it came to an end. I put so much work and effort into it, and I didn't get a gold watch or anything. Like if you retire from your job or something. Bob Daisley. He had more or less did note for note what Ray Gillan had already done. Talking about Tony Martin's performance was ushered in to top off what was to become the Eternal Idol. Of note, one alternate title in the running for the record was Blood God. It must be said that Tony's instructions were to match Ray's parts as closely as possible, and that he was hired on his ability to do that. Still, hearing the Gillan demos, there were divergencies, especially with respect to Hard Life to Love, where the creative choices from Martin were considerably all new and quite plentiful. It was difficult for me to evaluate him, continues Bob Daisley. I mean, I haven't heard anything else that Tony Martin's ever done. Just that album. I felt a bit sorry for Ray Gillan. He did a great performance on that album, singing, and that was all his phrasing. I wrote some of the lyrics for it, but that was all his phrasing on that album and his vocal ideas. And then they were replaced with Tony Martin. And Tony Martin just more or less did note for note what Ray Gillan had done. I felt a bit sorry for Ray Gillan not having his performance left on there. I don't know what happened. I can't remember if he just left or if he was fired or what happened. And Geoff Nicholls was a nice bloke to work with. I've always liked Geoff. He's got a good ear and he's pleasant to work with. I befriended Geoff and I met up with him from time to time if I was in America and have a drink, get together. Yeah, nice bloke. That album's got some good tracks on there. Mr. Iommi contrasts Martin with the band's immediately preceding singer, Glenn Hughes. Glenn comes with a lot of experience, and Glenn is totally original in his soul, but he's got a great feel, and he just doesn't have to he can make things happen just purely by opening his mouth, and it comes out really soulful. With Martin, I think it just takes, it's already been done by Glenn. And if you know what I mean, Glenn was Tony Martin's idol. But if Tony's a great singer, don't get me wrong, he's a very, very good. But I just found with Glenn, he's a lot more, we bounce off each other a lot easier. And he just comes up with so many ideas. To further obscure the making of this record, AIR Studios Montserrat location was of course used, Geoff Glicksman producing, as well as AIR's London location, Vic Coopersmith producing. Finally, Battery Studios in London was utilized, where noted metal man Chris Singeris, I can never get that name right, but the guy who produced Painkiller, took on the all-important role of getting Martin's performance down, mixing the album as well, and then recording a couple of bonus tracks in Some Kind of Woman, written by Tony Martin, and Black Moon, to surface on the 12-inch maxi single of The Shining. Some Kind of Woman was wholly inappropriate for Sabbath, sounding very much like a David Lee Roth solo track. I gotta disagree with that. From the speed metal boogie riff to the girly lyric to Tony's vocal melodies, totally and utterly. Totally and utterly? Okay, I'll continue reading. In actuality, this one was recorded with Dave Spitz in Montserrat, but was finished in London. Black Moon is actually a really cool Evil Woman song with a thumping Sabbatherian rhythm and dark, stormy melodies, bass playing courtesy of Geoff Nicholls. It would be revisited and re-recorded for the band's second album with Tony Martin, 1989's Headless Cross. Of bringing on Sangritas, Tony Iommi had complained about Glicksman wanting to take over the project and hire even more people to help finish it. Tony also complained about Glicksman's lack of knowledge with respect to digital technologies. Martin says a few words about Geoff Nicholls, the man at his point for 2 records straight, getting his due as a member of Black Sabbath. Quote, Geoff has contributed a lot. Geoff was never taken seriously for a long, long, long time. He's the funny man of the band. He makes everybody laugh. He's a clown. Great to be around. But he's like that all the time. Sometimes you want him to shut up because he's just so funny all the time. I'm like, will you just stop? I don't know what it is that put people off, but they never really took him seriously. But his input was huge. A lot of the Eternal Idol album was put together by Geoff, riffs and lyrics and stuff. And over the years, he's put in a great effort. I'm working with Geoff on some material right now, putting together some film scores. Now he comes around and he's telling me that they're taking him a lot more seriously, and he's even got a track on Ozzy's album or something. So he's starting to be recognized a little for his talent, because he does have a talent and it's kind of been lost a little. He's not been given his due, I don't think. He is like the Black Sabbath Bible, and I'm sure he wouldn't talk to you about some things, because there is a lot that shall forever remain. You might find that he might turn around and say, I don't want to talk about that. But he will talk to you. He's a good talker, and he's doing his own thing. Geoff was treated the way he was because the image makers, sometimes Iommi, sometimes management, were always trying to make the band look credible. The thinking was that the one thing that it is not usually associated with Sabbath is a keyboard player, so it was decided that Geoff would be off stage. But then Geoff had so much input in the band and was such a close friend of Iommi that he wouldn't be brought out on stage until they would then battle with the image thing, and Geoff would be off stage again. I don't think it was ever really resolved, but no one should doubt Geoff's input to Sabbath. He was absolutely right in there, very influential. He's in the Writers Guild of America now, and he's written some books, fiction about satanic stuff, and a couple of them have been picked up as film ideas. They're working on it now, and so he asked me to help him write music for some of the scores. You see, Ozzy is doing his fly-on-the-wall TV show kind of thing, this family thing. He's not out doing a world tour or anything. In any case, Geoff is tied more to Tony than he is to Ozzy, and so Geoff is at home. As we say in England, Geoff is in his residence, like the Queen. We used to call it the Eternal Idiot, jokes Martin, getting back to the record, referring to the missive uttered by Tony Iommi's Irish gardener. But seriously, that album was just thrust upon me. I had no time to rethink about joining the band. They gave me, I think, about 8 days to record the whole album, which is great because they had been in Montserrat for like a year and a half in the sunshine, and then they come back to London, rainy old London, and I have 8 days to finish the whole album. But that was thrust upon me with great speed, so I really didn't have time to think about it. Those 8 days it took to do the vocals likely went by much quicker than the 8 hours it took to shoot the album cover. What happened was Tony had wanted to use an 1889 Auguste Rodin sculptor, Idol Eternal, for the front cover shot, but his request was turned down. Not to be deterred, management hired a couple of models to reproduce the sculpture and had them spray painted gold. After the 8-hour shoot, the 2 models were sent to the hospital with paint poisoning, because of course they were. Y'all ain't never heard the Goldfinger story? Continuing, Ray Gillan even had cause to comment on the cover art, having been making the press rounds prior to the issue of the record, and more pertinently, prior to him not even ending up on that record. Quote, "Well, the title doesn't really apply to any members of the band," laughed Gillan. "We got the title from a Rodin statue of a naked woman and a man where the guy is kneeling with his hands tied behind his back while he's kissing her breast. It's very erotic. It's very beautiful. It elicits very strong responses in people, and that's exactly what we're trying to do with our music." Unquote. Gillan goes on to plump for the album. Quote, "We're really excited about the way things are going. Tony, in particular, has been revitalized by playing with a bunch of new, young guys, and he says he's having the best time he's had in a long time. We're out to show the people who said some nasty things about Black Sabbath the last time out that we're really strong now. This album, we feel, is really excellent, and we'll take a lot of pleasure from seeing a lot of critics eat their words. The other day, I heard a guy heard my name and asked if I was Ian Gillan's son. I thought that was kind of funny, but people have been really nice to me. They're a little skeptical until they hear the album, but after that they realize I belong and that Sabbath is really happening again. Tony's really let me do what I want to on the album as far as writing and singing goes, and that's all I can ask. He expects a lot from people, but no more than he expects from himself. Tony's amazing because he still lives for the music. He walks into a room and the whole Sabbath vibe is there with him. He's an incredible aura, and working with somebody like that is very exciting. He invented the sound that really is heavy metal." Many gravitate to Headless Cross as the best record of the Tony Martin years, but this writer much prefers The Eternal Idol. The album, issued November 23, 1987, opens elegantly with a triumphant epic track called The Shining, a song that went back in Sabbath's lore at least 3 years. A swirling cauldron of intro gives way to one of Tony's Geronimo riffs, one blessed with a sweet darkness found within Soundgarden's most Sabbath-like moments. As the verse cracks, the sound becomes deep purple-like with Nicholls' pulsating keys. Martin delivers a Dio-esque vocal, and then the song explodes for the chorus. Of note, Tony Martin's audition for the band was a run-through of The Shining, and only The Shining, and that was it. He was in. Unfortunately, the song's lyrical sentiment is clouded by an association with the popular Stephen King, Jack Nicholson film of the same name. Amusingly, for the video, because Sabbath was bass player challenged during its shoot, Daisley having opted out of touring, the band plucked a rocker enough looking guy off the street and put him in that role. Given he could play guitar, he was deemed suitable for their purposes. But the fact that he said he was the reincarnation of a red Indian chief caught the boys off guard. The video actually shows this mystery man quite a few times, not to mention, inexplicably, a hawk flying around. Quote, "I think the video Tony hated the most was The Shining," laughs Tony Martin. Yes, I think it was The Shining, where they've got him rotating on a turntable, going round and round and round, and he stood on this, for want of a better word, yes, a turntable. And there was somebody at his feet gently turning this turntable with him on it as he's playing guitar. And he said, "I feel like a right fucking twat doing this. Do we have to do this? and they're saying, oh, it's going to look great, And he did it, but I think that was his worst memory. The well-constructed, accessible, but very heavy song was launched as a single, but it failed. Oddly, the first 2 verses of the lyric are missing from the printed lyric sheet. Said Ray, obviously early in the process, I really like The Shining. I read the Stephen King book of the same name a while ago, and it made a big impression on me. When I started working on the material for the album, that was one of the topics that stayed in my mind. I really like the music on that song. I like the lyrics, and quite honestly, I think I sing the hell out of it. Next up was Ancient Warrior, original title The Axeman, a thumping, spooky, circular rocker. Daisley obscuring an anti-war message in mythological language. Tony's riff is inspired, and the break takes the song even higher. The next transition, housing some screechy, near shredling, but also Middle Eastern, Blackmore-esque flavorings from Wyoming. Hard Life to Love follows, and is the writer's favorite on the album. Sabbath coming up with a party rocker with soul and a certain aristocratic feel, like Whitesnake at their best. The lyric is nicely couched in a reality Sabbath themselves could have paid a bit more attention to. Daisley and Ray writing a blues to a life spent with booze and drugs. The verse section is richly melodic, allowing for a wandering bass line and soaring work from Martin. Glory Ride closes side 1 with a bang, trundling boldly on a one-note bass line. Wyoming in epic mode somewhat akin to his riff from The Shining, 3 tracks earlier. Martin's vocal is as sky high as the lyrical sentiment, the idea revolving around World War II pilots and their dogfights, with overtones to the suicide missions of kamikaze pilots as well. Born to Lose finds Wyoming incredibly topping most of his riffs from side 1, coming up with a driving freight train of a pattern. Martin echoing with a vocal scat to go along with the riff before diving back into his lyrics. Curiously, the whole thing revolves around a character that emphatically won't be losing this battle, but then again, getting into battles in the first place means you've already lost and slipped a rung on civilization's ladder. Next is Nightmare, in which Tony uses his slow then fast formula again, the riff solid and bankable, although strangely simple and accessible. A nice touch, an evil laugh by the disappeared Ray Gillan was left in the mix, this being the only bit of Ray's performance not meticulously replaced by Martin. Lyrically, the band slips a bit into formula, perhaps a good time for a break, which happens next with Scarlet Pimpernel, an acoustic instrumental awash in eerie keyboard atmospherics from Nicholls. Lost Forever is a kick-ass rocker verging on speed metal, but behaved in its squared-off chug somewhat akin to Symptom of the Universe. Wyoming's solo is spirited, musical, logical, as Martin delivers the goods, admonishing a man on the verge of execution for continuing to plead innocence when guilt is so plainly in his stare. The, quote, burning with fire break is horrible, possibly the first truly bad musical segment on this inspired record. Inspired despite the dire circumstances in which it was forged. The Eternal Idol closes with the record's title track, Sabbath delivering a lumbering epic reminiscent of Black Sabbath or select movements of the megalithic megalomania, although of course you can't force yourself to write like this, and this band is not that band. Lyrically, the front 2/3 seem to mimic a religious geezer lyric, while the back bit inexplicably sorry about that, seems to attack the world's power structures. Once again, this sounds like the new Sabbath trying to be the old Sabbath, and one must surely draw the conclusion that this is a fool's game, and that this band was doing just fine with earthly traditional romps, but romps just the same, like Hard Life to Love, Born to Lose, and The Shining. And yes, take those songs and the slight divergences together, and what you've got here is a record much more cohesive than Seventh Star, even if the bandness of it isn't much of an improvement. Martin adds an unmistakable continuity back to the Dio years, and Tony seems much more inspired, writing in this vein rather than the wayward stylings of the last record. Touring for the Eternal Idol was both brief and disastrous. On bass for some of the tour was Virginia Woolf's Joe Burt. Dave Spitz stepped back in as well, and on drums a combination of Terry Chimes, once Tory Crimes of the Clash, most recently of Cherry Bombs, and born-again touring drummer Bev Bevan. In fact, Eric Singer had been long gone from the band, having left in January of 1987 after his drum tracks were done long before work was finished on the album. Eric would unsuccessfully audition for Gary Moore's band and then next surfaced with Ray Gillan in Badlands, their stunning debut to be issued on June of 1989. Says Martin of Sabbath's highly publicized Hammersmith debacle, quote, "We were supposed to do a show in England, which we had the big private jet, whole thing. Flew into this place and it got canceled. And then we went to Greece to do a show in Athens. We had all sorts of things like that. In 1987, we had a cancellation in Rome when the Pope was playing an arena, and they put us in a theater instead. They took from us a 10,000-seat arena and put us in a 3,000-seat theater. And then there were kids outside, and the army was in, and somebody got shot, all sorts of stuff. We did 3/4 of the show, and then we had to pull it because they were rocking the buses and doing all sorts of stuff. But we had a good run. Mostly in the Tony Martin years, we were doing between 20,000 and 10,000 seat capacities. The odd 40,000 was in there, and the odd 5,000 was in there. But average that, there were 10,000 seats or something. We were doing okay. And then we went to South Africa, and I think we did something in Italy, and that's it. Yeah, South Africa, Sun City actually. And we really got slated for doing that because back then they had that apartheid thing going on, so that didn't go down well. It did with the locals, but not with the rest of the world in the music community. It was really weird, Tony Martin continues, adding context to the story. You know, when I first joined the band, I had absolutely no input into what was going on. I was basically swept into a void of Black Sabbathdom and the Black Sabbath Kingdom, this place where I'd never been, and I had no idea how any of it worked. All I had was my preconceived ideas of being a Black Sabbath fan, if you like. You go into this thinking, weird, whatever, but when you're in there, it's all taken out of your hands. You're just sort of worshipped around all these places. And when they said, "We're going to South Africa," I think everybody went, "What? What's this about? You can't go there." And I think everybody had the same reaction. And then they came back to us and said, "Okay, look, what we've done is, this is the score. We agreed to do the gigs as long as they allow a mixed audience." And we said, "Does that make any difference? Because the apartheid shit was still going on, so how does that help us get in there and not get shot or something?" And they said, "No, it's all cleared. We've done this. Everybody's agreed with it. All the varying parties and interested parties and all that." They said, "It's a great idea. It's cool as long as it's a mixed audience." So everybody in the band was like, "Oh, all right then." We went along with it. And when we got there, it was a mixed audience. There were white and black people in the same venues, but then I guess ultimately this was just a staged event. I mean, it had to be. I couldn't see how else it could have been arranged, but I have no idea how they would have arranged it. You know, who was involved in that. It was a completely bizarre situation to me. But I have to say, the gigs, when we got there, we played, the crowd was great. They really appreciated what we were doing. I suppose with a name like Sabbath, it's going to draw people anyway, especially if it's in a land where a band like that hadn't been before. We were doing 10,000 capacity. We were there for, well, a fortnight. Bev Bevan wouldn't go, no matter what they said to him, continues Martin. Management got us all together. We would have these meetings from time to time, and it didn't matter what they said to him. He just would not go. So he did Athens, the first show that I did with them, And then from Athens, he flew home, and we had Terry Chimes from The Clash on drums in South Africa with Dave Spitz, and then Joe Burt, another bass player. I mean, when I was in the band, we had different lineups. It's a constant changing story, Black Sabbath. Terry was put in touch with us via the management, and I guess they were just, to me now, scratching around to find anybody that would go to South Africa at the time. Of course, I knew nothing about it, so I said, yeah, whatever. Terry was good. I got on okay with Terry. He's actually an acupuncturist now in London, in High Street somewhere or something like that. But he's got a good, strong style, and he was able to, get around his kit. He had a huge cage. It was like a square frame, and all these drums hung off this frame. He had like 20 skins on there or something. Huge thing. He played real hard, and he got it all pretty much right. Fair play to him. He did a really good job of that. But the South African things stayed with us for a while, and then it just went away after a bit. Contrary to the above depiction of events, Iommi explained to the press at the time that Patrick Meehan's lawyers had convinced them that Sun City wasn't actually in South Africa, and that the geographically challenged Sobs were dumb enough to believe him. Status Quo and Queen were to receive similar denouncements for playing the White Enclave. 6 nights were logged, with Tony said to have received a Rolls Royce as part of the compensation package. Tony called this claim rubbish, adding that he's had one for 12 years, but there was no denying the payday was substantial. Tony had indeed talked to Queen about the situation beforehand and said he was encouraged to do it, adding that it was all in the service of delivering music to those who didn't get much of it. Back home, with respect to the Hammersmith cancellation, the band was in an embarrassing position of having their gear confiscated due to debts that had been piling up. As well, Tony cited tennis elbow and the Singapore flu. In conjunction with one other UK cancellation, not a single UK or US date was played in support of the Eternal Idol, Sabbath closing 1987 with what was to be their 13th lineup since 1980. This concludes the reading of Album 14 as related to the Eternal Idol from Martin Popoff's Born Again, Black Sabbath in the 80s and 90s. We will continue with Album 15, Headless Cross, in the next video. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it. Take care.